Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to some new members of our Patreon family: Debbie, Rowena, Linda Jane, Robert, and Mike. Thank you all so much for supporting this podcast. By becoming members of Patreon, you help us remain 100% listener-supported and ad-free for everyone, and it's very much appreciated. If you're interested in supporting Boring Books for Bedtime and finding out more about the perks available to subscribers, including exclusive episodes, full books, and giveaways found nowhere else, you'll find a link to Patreon in the show description. You'll also find a link to buymeacoffee.com, where you can support us with a one-time tip, no subscription required. I hope you'll take a moment to check them out. Now, let's read and relax. Find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight, let's continue a summer month of travel readings with more from Pictures from Italy by Charles Dickens, first written in 1846 and republished here in an edition in 1913 by Chapman and Hall Limited, London. Let's pick up right where we left off in our exploration of the city of Genoa. Let's begin. There are 3 theaters in the city, besides an old one now rarely opened. The most important, the Carlo Felice, the Opera House of Genoa, is a very splendid, commodious, and beautiful theater. A company of comedians were acting there when we arrived, and soon after their departure, a second-rate opera company came. The great season is not until the carnival time in the spring. Nothing impressed me so much in my visits here, which were pretty numerous, as the uncommonly hard and cruel character of the audience, who resent the slightest defect, take nothing good-humoredly, seem to be always lying in wait for an opportunity to hiss, and spare the actresses as little as the actors. But as there is nothing else of a public nature at which they are allowed to express the least disapprobation, perhaps they are resolved to make the most of this opportunity. There are a great number of Piedmontese officers, too, who are allowed the privilege of kicking their heels in the pit for next to nothing, gratuitous or cheap accommodation for these gentlemen being insisted on by the governor in all public or semi-public entertainments. They are lofty critics in consequence, and infinitely more exacting than if they made the unhappy manager's fortune. The Teatro Diurno, or Day Theatre, is a covered stage in the open air, where the performances take place by daylight in the cool of the afternoon, commencing at 4 or 5 o'clock and lasting some 3 hours. It is curious, sitting among the audience, to have a fine view of the neighboring hills and houses, and to see the neighbors at their windows looking on, and to hear the bells of the churches and convents ringing at most complete cross purposes with the scene. Beyond this, and the novelty of seeing a play in the fresh, pleasant air, with the darkening evening closing in, There is nothing very exciting or characteristic in the performances. The actors are indifferent, and though they sometimes represent one of Goldoni's comedies, the staple of the drama is French. Anything like nationality is dangerous to despotic governments and Jesuit beleaguered kings. The theater of puppets, or marionetti, a famous company from Milan, is without any exception the drollest exhibition I ever beheld in my life. I never saw anything so exquisitely ridiculous. They look between 4 and 5 feet high, but are really much smaller, for when a musician in the orchestra happens to put his hat on the stage, it becomes alarmingly gigantic and almost blots out an actor. They usually play a comedy and a ballet. The comic man in the comedy I saw one summer night is a waiter in an hotel. There never was such a locomotive actor since the world began. Great pains are taken with him. He has extra joints in his legs, and a practical eye with which he winks at the pit in a manner that is absolutely insupportable to a stranger, but which the initiated audience, mainly composed of the common people, receive, so they do everything else quite as a matter of course, and as if he were a man. His spirits are prodigious. He continually shakes his legs and winks his eye. And there is a heavy father with gray hair who sits down on the regular conventional stage bank and blesses his daughter in the regular conventional way, who is tremendous. No one would suppose it possible that anything short of a real man could be so tedious. It is the triumph of art. In the ballet, an enchanter runs away with the bride in the very hour of her nuptials. He brings her to his cave and tries to soothe her. They sit down on a sofa, the regular sofa in the regular place, and a procession of musicians enters, one creature playing a drum and knocking himself off his legs at every blow. These failing to delight her, dancers appear, 4 first, then 2, the flesh-colored 2. The way in which they dance, the height to which they spring, the impossible and inhuman extent to which they pirouette, the revelation of their preposterous legs, the coming down with a pause on the very tips of their toes when the music requires it, the gentleman's retiring up when it is the lady's turn, and the lady's retiring up when it is the gentleman's turn, the final passion of a pas de deux, and the going off with a bound. I shall never see a real ballet with a composed countenance again. I went another night to see these puppets act a play called St. Helena, or the Death of Napoleon. It began by the disclosure of Napoleon, with an immense head, seated on a sofa in his chamber at St. Helena, to whom his valet entered with this obscure announcement: Sir Yutsion Lao, the ow as in cow. Sir Hudson, that you could have seen his regimentals, was a perfect mammoth of a man to Napoleon, hideously ugly, with a monstrously disproportionate face, and a great clump for the lower jaw, to express his tyrannical and obdurate nature. He began his system of persecution by calling his prisoner General Bonaparte, to which the latter replied with the deepest tragedy, Sir Yutsion Lao, call me not thus. Repeat that phrase and leave me. I am Napoleon, Emperor of France. Sir Yutsion, nothing daunted, proceeded to entertain him with an ordinance of the British government, regulating the state he should preserve and the furniture of his rooms, and limiting his attendance to 4 or 5 persons. 4 or 5 for me, said Napoleon. Me. 100,000 men were lately at my sole command, and this English officer talks of 4 or 5 for me. Throughout the piece, Napoleon, who talked very like the real Napoleon, and was forever having small soliloquies by himself, was very bitter on these English officers and these English soldiers, to the great satisfaction of the audience, who were perfectly delighted to have Lau bullied, and who, whenever Lau said General Bonaparte, which he always did, always receiving the same correction, quite execrated him. It would be hard to say why, for Italians have little cause to sympathize with Napoleon, heaven knows. There was no plot at all, except that a French officer, disguised as an Englishman, came to propound a plan of escape, and being discovered, but not before Napoleon had magnanimously refused to steal his freedom, was immediately ordered off by Lau to be hanged, in 2 very long speeches, which Lau made memorable by winding up with "Yas," to show that he was English, which brought down thunders of applause. Napoleon was so affected by this catastrophe that he fainted away on the spot and was carried out by 2 other puppets. Judging from what followed, it would appear that he never recovered the shock, for the next act showed him in a clean shirt in his bed, curtains crimson and white, where a lady prematurely dressed in mourning brought 2 little children, who kneeled down by the bedside while he made a decent end, the last word on his lips being Waterloo. It was unspeakably ludicrous. Bonaparte's boots were so wonderfully beyond control, and did such marvelous things of their own accord, doubling themselves up, getting under tables and dangling in the air, and sometimes skating away with him out of all human knowledge when he was in full speech, mischances which were not rendered the less absurd by a settled melancholy depicted in his face. To put an end to one conference with Lau, he had to go to a table and read a book, when it was the finest spectacle I ever beheld, to see his body bending over the volume like a bootjack, and his sentimental eyes glaring obstinately into the pit. He was prodigiously good in bed with an immense collar to his shirt, and his little hands outside the coverlet. So was Dr. Antomarchi, represented by a puppet with long, lank hair, who, in consequence of some derangement of his wires, hovered about the couch like a vulture, and gave medical opinions in the air. He was almost as good as Lau, though the latter was great at all times, a decided brute and villain beyond all possibility of mistake. Lau was especially fine at the last, when hearing the doctor and the valet say, "The emperor is dead," he pulled out his watch and wound up the piece by exclaiming with characteristic brutality, "Ha ha, 11 minutes to 6, the general dead and the spy hanged." This brought the curtain down triumphantly. There is not in Italy, they say, and I believe them, a lovelier residence than the Palazzo Peschiere, or Palace of the Fish Ponds, whither we removed as soon as our 3 months' tenancy of the pink jail at Albaro had ceased and determined. It stands on a height within the walls of Genoa, but aloof from the town, surrounded by beautiful gardens of its own, adorned with statues, vases, fountains, marble basins, terraces, walks of orange trees and lemon trees, groves of roses and camellias. All its apartments are beautiful in their proportions and decorations, but the great hall, some 50 feet in height, with 3 large windows at the end, overlooking the whole town of Genoa, the harbor, and the neighboring sea, affords one of the most fascinating and delightful prospects in the world. Any house more cheerful and habitable than the great rooms are within, it would be difficult to conceive, and certainly nothing more delicious than the scene without, in sunshine or in moonlight, could be imagined. It is more like an enchanted place in an Eastern story than a grave and sober lodging. How you may wander on from room to room, and never tire of the wild fancies on the walls and ceilings, as bright in their fresh coloring as if they had been painted yesterday. Or how one floor, or even the great hall which opens on 8 other rooms, is a spacious promenade. Or how there are corridors and bedchambers above, which we never use and rarely visit, and scarcely know the way through. Or how there is a view of a perfectly different character on each of the 4 sides of the building, matters little. But that prospect from the hall is like a vision to me. I go back to it in fancy, as I have done in calm reality 100 times a day, and stand there looking out, with the sweet scents from the garden rising up about me in a perfect dream of happiness. There lies all Genoa in beautiful confusion, with its many churches, monasteries, and convents, pointing up into the sunny sky. And down below me, just where the roofs begin, a solitary convent parapet, fashioned like a gallery, with an iron across at the end, where sometimes early in the morning I have seen a little group of dark-veiled nuns gliding sorrowfully to and fro, and stopping now and then to peep down upon the waking world in which they have no part. Old Montefaccio, brightest of hills in good weather, but sulkiest when storms are coming on, is here upon the left. The fort within the walls, the good king built it to command the town and beat the houses of the Genoese about their ears in case they should be discontented, commands that height upon the right. The broad sea lies beyond in front there, and that line of coast, beginning by the lighthouse and tapering away, a mere speck in the rosy distance, is the beautiful coast road that leads to Nice. The garden near at hand, among the roofs and houses, all red with roses and fresh with little fountains, is the Acqua Sola, a public promenade, where the military band plays gaily, and the white veils cluster thick, and the Genoese nobility ride round and round and round, in state clothes and coaches at least, if not in absolute wisdom. Within a stone's throw, as it seems, the audience of the Day Theatre sit, their faces turned this way, but as the stage is hidden, it is very odd, without a knowledge of the cause, to see their faces changed so suddenly from earnestness to laughter, and odder still, to hear the rounds upon rounds of applause rattling in the evening air to which the curtain falls. But being Sunday night, they act their best and most attractive play. And now the sun is going down, in such magnificent array of red and green and golden light as neither pen nor pencil could depict, and to the ringing of the vesper bells darkness sets in at once without a twilight. Then lights begin to shine in Genoa and on the country road, and the revolving lanthorn out at sea there, flashing for an instant on this palace front and portico, illuminates it as if there were a bright moon bursting from behind a cloud, then merges it in deep obscurity. And this, so far as I know, is the only reason why the Genoese avoid it after dark, and think it haunted. My memory will haunt it many nights in time to come, but nothing worse, I will engage. The same ghost will occasionally sail away, as I did one pleasant autumn evening, into the bright prospect, and sniff the morning air at Marseilles. The corpulent hairdresser was still sitting in his slippers outside his shop door there, but the twirling ladies in the window had ceased to twirl and were languishing stock still, with their beautiful faces addressed to blind corners of the establishment where it was impossible for admirers to penetrate. The steamer had come from Genoa in a delicious run of 18 hours, and we were going to run back again by the Cornice road from Nice, not being satisfied to have seen only the outsides of the beautiful towns that rise in picturesque white clusters from among the olive woods and rocks and hills upon the margin of the sea. The boat which started for Nice that night at 8 o'clock was very small, and so crowded with goods that there was scarcely room to move. Neither was there anything to cat on board except bread, nor to drink except coffee. But being due at Nice at about 8 or so in the morning, this was of no consequence. So when we began to wink at the bright stars, in involuntary acknowledgment of their winking at us, we turned into our berths in a crowded but cool little cabin, and slept soundly till morning. The boat, being as dull and dogged a little boat as ever was built, it was within an hour of noon when we turned into Nice harbor, where we very little expected anything but breakfast. But we were laden with wool. Wool must not remain in the custom house at Marseilles more than 12 months at a stretch without paying duty. It is the custom to make fictitious removals of unsold wool to evade this law, to take it somewhere when the 12 months are nearly out, bring it straight back again and warehouse it as a new cargo for nearly 12 months longer. This wool of ours had come originally from some place in the East. It was recognized as Eastern produce the moment we entered the harbor. Accordingly, the gay little Sunday boats full of holiday people, which had come off to greet us, were warned away by the authorities. We were declared in quarantine, and a great flag was solemnly run up to the masthead on the wharf to make it known to all the town. It was a very hot day indeed. We were unshaved, unwashed, undressed, unfed, and could hardly enjoy the absurdity of lying blistering in a lazy harbor, with the town looking on from a respectful distance. All manner of whiskered men in cocked hats discussing our fate at a remote guardhouse, with gestures, we looked very hard at them through telescopes, expressive of a week's detention at least, and nothing whatever the matter all the time. But even in this crisis, the brave courier achieved a triumph. He telegraphed somebody, I saw nobody, either naturally connected with the hotel or put en rapport with the establishment for that occasion only. The telegraph was answered, and in half an hour or less there came a loud shout from the guardhouse. The captain was wanted. Everybody helped the captain into his boat. Everybody got his luggage and said we were going. The captain rowed away and disappeared behind a little jutting corner of the galley slaves' prison, and presently came back with something very sulkily. The brave courier met him at the side and received the something as its rightful owner. It was a wicker basket folded in a linen cloth, and in it were 2 great bottles of wine, a roast fowl, some salt fish chopped with garlic, a great loaf of bread, a dozen or so of peaches, and a few other trifles. When we had selected our own breakfast, the brave courier invited a chosen party to partake of these refreshments, and assured them that they need not be deterred by motives of delicacy, as he would order a second basket to be furnished at their expense, which he did, no one knew how, and by the captain being again summoned, again sulkily returned with another something, over which my popular attendant presided as before, carving with a clasp knife, his own personal property, something smaller than a Roman sword. The whole party on board were made merry by these unexpected supplies, but none more so than a loquacious little Frenchman, who got drunk in 5 minutes, and a sturdy cappuccino friar, who had taken everybody's fancy mightily, and was one of the best friars in the world, I verily believe. He had a free, open countenance, and a rich, brown, flowing beard, and was a remarkably handsome man of about 50. He had come up to us early in the morning, and inquired whether we were sure to be at Nice by 11, saying that he particularly wanted to know, because if we reached it by that time, he would have to perform Mass, and must deal with the consecrated wafer fasting, whereas if there were no chance of his being in time, he would immediately breakfast. He made this communication under the idea that the brave courier was the captain, and indeed he looked much more like it than anybody else on board. Being assured that we should arrive in good time, he fasted and talked, fasting, to everybody, with the most charming good humor, answering jokes at the expense of friars, with other jokes at the expense of laymen, and saying that, friar as he was, he would engage to take up the 2 strongest men on board, one after the other, with his teeth, and carry them along the deck. Nobody gave him the opportunity, but I dare say he could have done it, for he was a gallant, noble figure of a man, even in the cappuccino dress, which is the ugliest and most ungainly that can well be. All this had given great delight to the loquacious Frenchman, who gradually patronized the friar very much, and seemed to commiserate him as one who might have been born a Frenchman himself, but for an unfortunate destiny. Although his patronage was such as a mouse might bestow upon a lion, he had a vast opinion of its condescension, and in the warmth of that sentiment occasionally rose on tiptoe to slap the friar on the back. When the baskets arrived, it being then too late for Mass, the friar went to work bravely, eating prodigiously of the cold meat and bread, drinking deep draughts of the wine, smoking cigars, taking snuff, sustaining an uninterrupted conversation with all hands, and occasionally running to the boat's side and hailing somebody on shore, with the intelligence that we must be got out of this quarantine somehow or other, as he had to take part in a great religious procession in the afternoon. After this, he would come back, laughing lustily from pure good humor, while the Frenchman wrinkled his small face into 10,000 creases and said how droll it was, and what a brave boy was that friar. At length, the heat of the sun without and the wine within made the Frenchman sleepy. So, in the noontide of his patronage of his gigantic protege, he lay down among the wool and began to snore. It was 4 o'clock before we were released, and the Frenchman, dirty and woolly and snuffy, was still sleeping when the friar went ashore. As soon as we were free, we all hurried away to wash and dress, that we might make a decent appearance at the procession, and I saw no more of the Frenchman until we took up our station in the main street to see it pass, when he squeezed himself into a front place, elaborately renovated, threw back his little coat to show a broad-barred velvet waistcoat, sprinkled all over with stars, then adjusted himself and his cane so as utterly to bewilder and transfix the friar when he should appear. The procession was a very long one, and included an immense number of people divided into small parties, each party chanting nasally on its own account, without reference to any other, and producing a most dismal result. There were angels, crosses, virgins carried on flat boards surrounded by cupids, crowns, saints, missals, infantry, tapers, monks, nuns, relics, dignitaries of the church in green hats, walking under crimson parasols, and here and there a species of sacred street lamp hoisted on a pole. We looked out anxiously for the Cappuccini, and presently their brown robes and corded girdles were seen coming on in a body. I observed the little Frenchman chuckle over the idea that when the friar saw him in the broad-barred waistcoat, he would mentally exclaim, "Is that my patron? That distinguished man?" and would be covered with confusion. Ah, never was the Frenchman so deceived. As our friend the Cappuccino advanced with folded arms, he looked straight into the visage of the little Frenchman, with a bland, serene, composed abstraction not to be described. There was not the faintest trace of recognition or amusement on his features, not the smallest consciousness of bread and meat, wine, snuff, or cigars. "C'est lui-même," I heard the little Frenchman say in some doubt. Oh yes, it was himself. It was not his brother or his nephew very like him. It was he. He walked in great state, being one of the superiors of the order, and looked his part to admiration. There never was anything so perfect of its kind as the contemplative way in which he allowed his placid gaze to rest on us, as if he had never seen us in his life and didn't see us then. The Frenchman, quite humbled, took off his hat at last, but the friar still passed on with the same imperturbable serenity, and the broad-barred waistcoat, fading into the crowd, was seen no more. The procession wound up with a discharge of musketry that shook all the windows in the town. Next afternoon we started for Genoa, by the famed Cornice Road. The half-French, half-Italian Vetturino, who undertook with his little rattling carriage and pair to convey us thither in 3 days, was a careless, good-looking fellow, whose light-heartedness and singing propensities knew no bounds, as long as we went on smoothly. So long he had a word and a smile and a flick of his whip for all the peasant girls, and odds and ends of the somnambula for all the echoes. So long he went jingling through every little village, with bells on his horses and rings in his ears, a very meteor of gallantry and cheerfulness. But it was highly characteristic to see him under a slight reverse of circumstances. When in one part of the journey we came to a narrow place where a wagon had broken down and stopped up the road, his hands were twined in his hair immediately, as if a combination of all the direst accidents in life had suddenly fallen on his devoted head. He swore in French, prayed in Italian, and went up and down, beating his feet on the ground in a very ecstasy of despair. There were various carters and mule drivers assembled round the broken wagon, and at last some man of an original turn of mind proposed that a general and joint effort should be made to get things to rights again and clear the way, an idea which I verily believe would never have presented itself to our friend, though we had remained there until now. It was done at no great cost of labor, but at every pause in the doing his hands were wound in his hair again, as if there were no ray of hope to lighten his misery. The moment he was on his box once more and clattering briskly downhill, he returned to the somnambula and the peasant girls as if it were not in the power of misfortune to depress him. Much of the romance of the beautiful towns and villages on this beautiful road disappears when they are entered, for many of them were very miserable. The streets are narrow, dark, and dirty, the inhabitants lean and squalid, and the withered old women with their wiry gray hair twisted up into a knot on the top of the head, like a pad to carry loads on, are so intensely ugly, both along the Riviera and in Genoa too, that seen straggling about in dim doorways with their spindles, or crooning together in by-corners, they are like a population of witches, except that they certainly are not to be suspected of brooms or any other instrument of cleanliness. Neither are the pig-skins, in common use to hold wine, and hung out in the sun in all directions, by any means ornamental, as they always preserve the form of very bloated pigs, with their heads and legs cut off, dangling upside down by their own tails. These towns, as they are seen in the approach, however, nestling with their clustering roofs and towers among trees on steep hillsides, or built upon the brink of noble bays, are charming. The vegetation is everywhere luxuriant and beautiful, and the palm tree makes a novel feature in the novel scenery. In one town, San Remo, a most extraordinary place, built on gloomy open arches so that one might ramble underneath the whole town, there are pretty terrace gardens. In other towns there is the clang of shipwrights' hammers and the building of small vessels on the beach. In some of the broad bays, the fleets of Europe might ride at anchor. In every case, each little group of houses presents in the distance some enchanting confusion of picturesque and fanciful shapes. The road itself, now high above the glittering sea, which breaks against the foot of the precipice, now turning inland to sweep the shore of a bay, now crossing the stony bed of a mountain stream, now low down on the beach, now winding among riven rocks of many forms and colors, now checkered by a solitary ruined tower, one of a chain of towers built in old time to protect the coast from the invasions of the Barbary corsairs, presents new beauties every moment. When its own striking scenery is past, and it trails on through a long line of suburb lying on the flat seashore to Genoa, then the changing glimpses of that noble city and its harbor awaken a new source of interest, freshened by every huge, unwieldy, half-inhabited old house in its outskirts, and coming to its climax when the city gate is reached, and all Genoa, with its beautiful harbor and neighboring hills, bursts proudly on the view. To Parma, Modena, and Bologna. I strolled away from Genoa on the 6th of November, bound for a good many places, England among them. But first for Piacenza, for which town I started in the coupe of a machine, something like a traveling caravan, in company with the brave courier and a lady with a large dog, who howled dolefully at intervals all night. It was very wet and very cold, very dark and very dismal. We traveled at the rate of barely 4 miles an hour and stopped nowhere for refreshment. At 10 o'clock next morning, we changed coaches at Alessandria, where we were packed up in another coach, the body whereof would have been small for a fly, in company with a very old priest, a young Jesuit his companion, who carried their breviaries and other books, and who, in the exertion of getting into the coach, had made a gash of pink leg between his black stocking and his black knee shorts that reminded one of Hamlet in Ophelia's closet, only it was visible on both legs, a provincial avvocato, and a gentleman with a red nose that had an uncommon and singular sheen upon it, which I never observed in the human subject before. In this way we traveled on until 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the roads being still very heavy and the coach very slow. To mend the matter, the old priest was troubled with cramps in his legs, so that he had to give a terrible yell every 10 minutes or so, and be hoisted out by the united efforts of the company, the coach always stopping for him with great gravity. This disorder and the roads form the main subject of conversation. Finding in the afternoon that the coupe had discharged 2 people, and had only 1 passenger inside, a monstrous ugly Tuscan with a great purple mustache, of which no man could see the ends when he had his hat on, I took advantage of its better accommodation, and in company with this gentleman, who was very conversational and good-humored, traveled on until nearly 11 o'clock at night, when the driver reported that he couldn't think of going any farther, and we accordingly made a halt at a place called Stradella. The inn was a series of strange galleries surrounding a yard where our coach and a wagon or 2, and a lot of fowls and firewood, were all heaped up together higgledy-piggledy, so that you didn't know and couldn't have taken your oath which was a fowl and which was a cart. We followed a sleepy man with a flaring torch into a great cold room, where there were 2 immensely broad beds, on what looked like two immensely broad deal dining tables. Another deal table of similar dimensions in the middle of the bare floor, 4 windows, and 2 chairs. Somebody said it was my room, and I walked up and down it for half an hour or so, staring at the Tuscan, the old priest, the young priest, and the avocado. Red Nose lived in the town and had gone home, who sat upon their beds and stared at me in return. The rather dreary whimsicality of this stage of the proceedings is interrupted by an announcement from the brave, he had been cooking, that supper is ready, and to the priest's chamber, the next room and the counterpart of mine, we all adjourn. The first dish is a cabbage, boiled with a great quantity of rice in a tureen full of water, and flavored with cheese. It is so hot, and we are so cold, that it appears almost jolly. The second dish is some little bits of pork fried with pig's kidneys. The third, 2 red fowls. The fourth, 2 little red turkeys. The fifth, a huge stew of garlic and truffles and I don't know what else. And this concludes the entertainment. Before I can sit down in my own chamber and think it of the dampest, the door opens, and the brave comes moving in the middle of such a quantity of fuel that he looks like Burnham Wood taking a winter walk. He kindles this heap in a twinkling, and produces a jorum of hot brandy and water, for that bottle of his keeps company with the seasons, and now holds nothing but the purest eau de vie. When he has accomplished this feat, he retires for the night, and I hear him for an hour afterwards, and indeed until I fall asleep, making jokes in some outhouse, apparently under the pillow, where he is smoking cigars with a party of confidential friends. He never was in the house in his life before, but he knows everybody everywhere, before he has been anywhere 5 minutes, and is certain to have attracted to himself in the meantime the enthusiastic devotion of the whole establishment. This is at 12 o'clock at night. At 4 o'clock next morning he is up again, fresher than a full-blown rose, making blazing fires without the least authority from the landlord, producing mugs of scalding coffee when nobody else can get anything but cold water, and going out into the dark streets and roaring for fresh milk on the chance of somebody with a cow getting up to supply it. While the horses are coming, I stumble out into the town too. It seems to be all one little piazza, with a cold, damp wind blowing in and out of the arches alternately in a sort of pattern. But it is profoundly dark and raining heavily, and I shouldn't know it tomorrow if I were taken there to try, which heaven forbid. The horses arrive in about an hour. In the interval the driver swears, sometimes Christian oaths, sometimes pagan oaths. Sometimes, when it is a long compound oath, he begins with Christianity and merges into paganism. Various messengers are dispatched, not so much after the horses as after each other, for the first messenger never comes back, and all the rest imitate him. At length the horses appear, surrounded by all the messengers, some dragging them and all shouting abuse to them. Then the old priest, the young priest, the avocado, the Tuscan, and all of us take our places, and sleepy voices proceeding from the doors of extraordinary hutches in diverse parts of the yard cry out, "Addio, corriere mio, buon viaggio, corriere," salutations which the courier with his face one monstrous grin returns in like manner as we go jolting and wallowing away through the mud. At Piacenza, which was 4 or 5 hours' journey from the inn at Stradella, we broke up our little company before the hotel door, with diverse manifestations of friendly feeling on all sides. The old priest was taken with the cramp again before he had got halfway down the street, and the young priest laid the bundle of books on the doorstep while he dutifully rubbed the old gentleman's legs. The client of the avocado was waiting for him at the yard gate, and kissed him on each cheek with such a resounding smack that I am afraid he had either a very bad case or a scantily furnished purse. The Tuscan, with a cigar in his mouth, went loitering off, carrying his hat in his hand that he might the better trail up the ends of his disheveled mustache, and the brave courier, as he and I strolled away to look about us, began immediately to entertain me with the private histories and family affairs of the whole party. And before we enter what is surely another fascinating town in Italy, I think we'll end this evening's reading from Pictures from Italy by Charles Dickens. Once again, a most remarkable collection of beautiful and absurd imagery from a mighty writer. I hope you enjoyed that. If you'd like to read this wonderful work for yourself, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect, suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, or request more from one we've already started, you can drop me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.